All right, good evening, everyone. I hope y'all can hear me. My name is Will Best. I'm the museum manager for the Champaign County History Museum. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, even with the rain in the forecast, for tonight's evening lecture with our history talk. Today I'll be introducing our speaker, historian and author Bob Sampson. Robert Sampson is editor of the Journal in the Illinois State Historical Society and taught the U.S. history at Millikan University and at the University of Illinois. His first book, John L. O'Sullivan and His Times, the biography of a 19th century journalist who popularized the term manifest destiny, first appeared in 2003. Today I'll be talking about some of the topics in his new book, Ballast, Deadbeats, and Muffins, Inside Early Baseball in Illinois, which was published last spring and emerged from nearly a decade of research on the game in Illinois between 1865 and 1870. It goes beyond the mechanics of the game to engage its social impact and the underlying tensions leading to a shift in baseball's goals and purposes in those early years. More than 1,000 organized clubs rose during those years, including the Champaign Empire Baseball Club, as well as clubs in Decatur, Arcola, Danville, Bloomington, Springfield, and many other places. If you haven't gotten a chance to check out the map of Illinois that features where all of those teams were located, you absolutely should at the end of this talk. The sometimes distorted origins of baseball, difficulties in obtaining and keeping playing fields, the rudimentary equipment, which meant no gloves, and the banning of play in some communities paint a vivid portrait of baseball's early years. And so now let's welcome Robert Sampson as we learn a little bit more about baseball in early Illinois.
Thank you. I want to introduce a couple people first. The type of baseball we're talking about is actually being played now in Champaign, Illinois. Where did he go? There's Jed, yeah. Jed Willard is one of the co-captains and co-founders of a team called the Champaign Clippers. You can tell that by his shirt. They play over in Weaver Park, but you have to enter Weaver Park off of Washington Street and go behind the middle school, and there it is. And they play with the rules, right, of 1858, so no gloves, which is why Chet has these nice big knuckles, like all vintage baseball players. And I see there's some people here, too many people here that know me, so I'm going to have to really mind my manners and be careful. And also, I should add that Will's father, Tom Best, has a great new book coming out within the next month or so on the history of baseball in Monmouth, Illinois, which was one of those towns on the map there that was very active and was one of the last teams to hang on, as we shall see towards the end of this period. So I'd like you to imagine a day, probably not unlike today is going to be by the time we get out of here. On this particular day, it was a Saturday, August 31st, 1867. It had rained in the morning, leaving the field muddy and slippery, and what they would have known as a field would be to us just as simply an open pasture. There was no infield, there was no baselines. It was just hopefully a relatively flat piece of ground without trees in the middle of it, but that wasn't always possible. The game was going to be between the lawyers of Urbana and the lawyers of Champaign. And we can all pity the umpire that had to adjudicate that game. We have a quotation about it from the old Champaign County Union and News called, and this is a description, "The sleek bald head of Judge Ayers bobbling along between the bases." The full quote goes this way, and this will give you sort of a sense. In fact, it was headlined, "A Fearful Sight." Indeed, it presented one of those fearful sights which beggars description. We saw dignified fielders slide along on all fours in vain attempts to stop the ball. We saw the same ball suddenly dropped, and the fingers of the dropper blowed as though badly burned. We saw the sleek bald pate of Judge Ayers bobbling along between the bases. We heard all those 18 lawyers bossing the game at the same time. Imagine that. We heard eloquent disciples of Blackstone and Chitty demur to the decision of the umpire and argue side of the question a la courthouse. This game lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Was won by Urbana 68-61 because the sun went down. And they hadn't invented lights yet. What this game, and we'll talk more, this is actually a muffin game, and we'll talk about what a muffin game was in a minute. What this represents is sort of this, what was known as and called a baseball fever that swept Illinois and Champaign County, among many other places, as you can see on the map, between about 1865 and then 1870, when it all sort of changes. The game doesn't go away, but the spirit that drove this thing that was actually compared in some newspapers to a cholera epidemic. It was just catching. Nobody could seem to avoid it. Swept the state. Now, what's a muffin game, and these become very popular throughout this period. First, as sort of a way to get in on the fun. People who were not good enough to play on a starting nine, but had heard about the game and wanted to experience the fun, they could play. And later on, it sort of becomes a way, as Peter Morris shows in his great book, But Didn't We Have Fun, about this period, sort of a way to satirize, make fun of the increasing seriousness that was being wrapped around the game and taking the fun out of it. Well, why? What's going on here? Well, we're talking about baseball as in a very different format than we're used to it today. For one thing, the people who are going to be playing it, unlike most of us in this room, did not grow up throwing and catching balls, especially with gloves, or trying to, have that cylinder of the bat head meet a spinning ball and make a solid connection. This was all new to most of these people because the game was not really that widespread before. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a Cliff's Notes version here of what is the history of this game, baseball, because there are just so many misconceptions and, frankly, some just outright lies about how it started. You can, and thanks to Dan Monroe, I know this because I was down here on the back row, who's got several distinguished books himself, and I'm waiting for the next one anytime. Did a course on the history of baseball for several semesters over there. Historians have actually found a bat and ball game, not unlike baseball, being played in ancient Egypt. It's actually on hieroglyphics. And I think probably the first time some Neanderthal or Cro-Magnon picked up a club and a rock and decided to whack the rock, that was probably the start of what we would call ball and bat games. Excuse me here. They get this going. All right. There we go. We got that. So we'll get to this New York game in a minute. Over the centuries, we get all sorts of bat and ball games, some involving a ball, some involving things called traps, pieces of wood in through ancient England or whatever. But they were largely children's games. Adults didn't pay much attention to them. It's something, well, this will keep the kids occupied. Especially a British game called rounders. This is going to become a very controversial point in America later on. In America, as early as the American Revolution and after, we had something called common baseball, which would be sort of a combination of Australian rules rugby, World Wrestling Federation, and maybe a little baseball. They were very unregulated. It was sort of a free-for-all. You could no telling how many people would be on a side, and they were played at militia musters and election days. And in colonial America, if you wanted to have a good drunk, those were 2 days when you could really do it, and so they would play baseball sometimes in between. There were few rules, as I said, no limits on the players, and it was sort of a rough game. Now, it ends up, the key thing for us, and why we call it the New York game, is we would go to Manhattan Island, which was New York then. They didn't have the boroughs. It's just Manhattan is what was New York City. It's having a tremendous influx of population, especially after the Erie Canal goes online in the 1820s, because that's where the money is. You know, if you're a young person, you don't want to get up before dawn and milk those cows. You don't want to try and make a farm on fields that are full of granite. You know, you want some adventure. You get yourself to New York City, especially if you have a little education. So you have a lot of young men that are coming into New York unsupervised, no parents, nobody to tell them, don't go in there or don't do that. So what happens is there's a great concern about morality. How are we going to keep these young men out of the houses of ill repute, the oyster bars, you know, everybody loves a good oyster bar, you know, taverns, what have you, and they're going to dissipate themselves, and it's going to be the downfall of New York. And of course, they were right. It has been ever since. But they're going to do something about it. So they're looking for new ideas. And one of these sort of new ideas is, hey, get these guys outside, especially in areas maybe across the Hudson River over in Hoboken. There's a sort of a public amusement park there. And give them healthy outdoor exercise rather than watching boxing or betting on horse racing. That was the two primary spectator sports at the time, boxing and horse racing, illegal in many places. So there's concern over this. Another concern, which I think we might recognize today, is these are young men on the make. They're going to start as an assistant low-level clerk for somebody, you know, in a law office or an accounting office or whatever. They're just like young people today. They want to make connections. They want to meet people, right? You're probably like me. Remember, if you moved into a town and you were in the business class, you wanted to get yourself into that Rotary, right? And if you couldn't get into Rotary, which I guess is having their 100th anniversary here in town tonight, get yourself in the Kiwanis or whoever, because you could meet people. You could make connections and maybe help your business. So I think this is another attraction of it. So they're playing a game which is getting close to what we would recognize today as baseball. And that's accelerated in 1845 when a club called the New York Knickerbockers, which is sort of a club of these professional young men, lawyers, clerks, hopeful businessmen, including even a doctor, who we'll get to in a minute, calls itself the Knickerbockers. It's not the first club, but it's the one that's remembered because what they do is something nobody else has done. They write down rules. Wow, you know, imagine that. They don't have to have a conference before the game and say, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to allow? How many people on the side? They write down some rules. And they were strange rules to us, but they were rules. There were like 26 of them. And most of them were not about the game, but about player conduct and responsibilities of the club. Sort of an amazingly simple set of rules. The winner of a game was the first team to score 21 runs. There were varying numbers of players on each side. You might have 9, you might have 7, you might have 11, depending on, I think there's nothing in the rules that says that. Over time, rules were added to address oversights and improve the game. And we eventually get to 9 players, 9 innings, 90-foot baselines, 3 outs. And we also get something called the shortstop position. The key guy, who do you think is the key guy in this picture? One of them is an outright fake, but I'll point him out in a minute. One of these guys is in the Hall of Fame, and in his Hall of Fame plaque, everything on it's a lie except for his name. So who's the real key guy? Anybody want to guess? No reason you should know. Pardon?
Top middle.
That's the guy that is. Everything's a lie. but there's a very best-selling book called The Father of Baseball about Alexander Cartwright. And I can tell you why that's all a lie later on if you're interested. This guy with a cigar. Remember the time when I had a family doctor back when I was growing up that always chewed on a cigar. When are you going to find a doctor chewing on a cigar? This is Daniel Luce's Doc Adams. And Doc Adams is the guy that makes what we would call the modern game. And if we're lucky, he's going to get on the Hall of Fame ballot later this year and finally get into the Hall of Fame. So we get what becomes known as the New York game. And from the 1830s and 1850s, it's largely concentrated around New York, especially in Brooklyn. Brooklyn actually becomes the baseball capital of the United States. But it's a New York game, hence it's called the New York game, to set it aside from other types of baseball or bat ball games, the New England game and town ball, which are being played in Boston and Philadelphia, respectively. Before the Civil War, the New York game jumps across the Alleghenies and starts coming through the Midwest. Actually, it gets as far as Illinois. There's a team in Chicago, a couple teams in Chicago. There's a team in Freeport, one of the best-known teams was in Freeport, and there's a team in Alton. Actually, in 1858, the Chicago Excelsiors, which was the primary team in Chicago, has a split squad game. And how do they choose which side plays? Who's in favor of Abraham Lincoln and who's in favor of Stephen Douglas? And the Douglas people win. So Lincoln had to wait 2 years before he got a win. So it was here. The Civil War wipes that out. People are going off to war. Now the game, persists to some degree, but this explosive period of growth is sort of rolled back until 1865, when it takes off. Between 1865 and 1870, there's more than 1,000 teams in Illinois. Some in places you cannot find on the map today because it was my job to try and find them on the map. And it took a lot of time to do it. Some of these, each of those pins represents a town that had a team, but some of them, say like Cairo, had 15 teams. Springfield had several teams. Champaign, there's actually Champaign-Urbana, there's 2 or 3 teams here as well. They go across the state, as you can see, from Galena to Cairo, Danville to Moline, and Alton to African Point. Anybody here been to African Point? I was going through a newspaper microfilm one day and about a game between a team down by Charleston. The name of the little place escapes me. They had a college at one time. It's hardly anything now. And they had beat the Africans of such and such a place. They didn't say where it was. They said they beat the Africans. I think, holy cow. God, was there a black team in southeastern Illinois in 1867? I thought, I've got a great discovery here. Well, I don't think there were any black people in Crawford County, which is where it's at. And it's an old name for a portion of Crawford County. That's where Robinson is, if you like what that Heath candy bars and the oil refineries are. They had a team, nicknamed the Africans, from African Point. Now these clubs, these thousands of clubs, more than 1,000 clubs, and those are the ones we know about. Now, I'm going to break out here just to, excuse me, because I always do this, I apologize. Why do we have all these gaps here? Especially over in here. They're newspaper deserts. Nothing has survived. So the only way we know about some teams is if they happen to play somebody who we have a newspaper for, such as Taylorville or Mattoon, and we know their existence because there's a story in one of those papers about Pena defeating that team. So I'm sure if somebody ever discovers a trunk full of old newspapers in an attic somewhere, that could easily go up. But those are the ones that we were able to trace by looking at every extant newspaper from that period in Illinois. These clubs there was organized and unorganized. Unorganized baseball was probably much more prevalent and much more of a pain. That's just young people or adults getting together wherever they can find the space, and that might be in the courthouse square, it might be in the street, and playing baseball. And we know, only reason we know about that is when somebody gets mad, like the City Council of Bloomington, or the City Council of Cairo, or the City Council of Decatur, and says, guess what? No more baseball allowed in the city limits. But these organized clubs are the ones we're looking at here. And they take great care. They're very formal. They have meetings, they have constitutions, they have bylaws, they have rituals and customs, which we'll talk about. And this is well covered. They meet in the courthouses, in lawyers' offices. These are serious people. But Peter Morris argues, and I think he's probably right, the reason they have all this structure is because if they don't, they'll be fooling around and laughing and having so much fun in the meetings, nothing will get done. So they have bylaws, constitutions, all sorts of stuff. There we go. There's the map. That never does work out. This is the guy, if you want to have a father of baseball, though he didn't invent the game, this is him, Henry Chadwick. This is this little book. This is a copy of Haney's Guide from 1867. And this is what they would have used. Because most of this book, very few rules. We had not got really creative about cheating yet, so they hadn't figured out ways to break the rules, so they didn't have a lot. Most of this book is about how to organize a club, a model constitution, what type of bylaws you should have, and then a great section about how to play each position and what type of people you should recruit to your club. There's a famous line in here I'm going to try and quote by memory. Chadwick says, "Don't elect bad-tempered men to your club. They will ruin it for everybody." If only some vintage baseball teams would learn that. Not my friends, the Clippers, but Jed and I probably could name a couple of clubs that could use that. So who is Chadwick? Chadwick is really he's not the first baseball writer, but he's the one that becomes most influential. This old boy is an English immigrant. He was the half-brother of a famous English social reformer, Sir Edwin. Was it Edwin Chadwick? I'm trying to channel my inner Walt Arnstein right now and remember what that was. And it was a reformist. The Chadwicks had been reformers going back who knows how long in England. His particular branch comes to the United States. And so he's a reformer. And so when he's doing all this stuff, he has a vision of what he wants baseball to be. And that's in here, between the lines. And he's very influential. He's sometimes called Father Chadwick. He actually lives until 1908. How do you suppose he dies?
Got hit in the head with a baseball.
Close, yeah, not too far off. He had a bad cold, so what does he do? He goes to opening day at Washington Park, where the Brooklyn team was playing, catches a worse cold in the stands, goes home, and a few days later dies. So that's a pretty long record. In Champaign County, in the area, you had several clubs. We had the main club in Champaign was the Champaign Empires, which I believe was earlier called the Champaign Baseball Club. They were always changing names. The Prairie Baseball Club, which might have been what we call a junior club, and I can explain the difference later on if you want to know. The Urbana Continentals, and the Urbana Baseball Club, and the Urbana Pioneers. Again, some of these might have gone back and forth. Homer had the Eurekas. A lot of Eureka clubs running around Illinois. They like that name. 7 clubs in Onarga. Yeah, so every person probably belonged to 3 different clubs. I don't know. Including one of my favorites, the Hunky Dories. And Hunky Dory meant then just what it means now, having a good time. Philo, the Frontier Baseball Club. Rantoul Baseball Club. Savoy, the Rural Baseball Club. And the Prairie Baseball Club. Sydney had a baseball club. All of these this is being repeated all across the state. As soon as one club is formed, it seems like neighboring communities say, well, we got to have one of those too. And they make an effort and keep them going for at least for a while. Again, we see social networking functions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the teams in Springfield. The boy, then as now, if you want to see the intermingling of politics and money and influence, you look at baseball in Springfield. And why certain things happen in Springfield that don't happen other places, and some of the things they enjoy there. Because today we would say a lot of those players had fathers who had clout. They could get things done. So these were all key part of the thing. The team names, a lot of wide awakes. I know Dan Monroe knows what the wide awakes mean, where they come from, right?
Sure.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln, right? The Abraham Lincoln shock troops from 18. They go down the street with these torches and stuff. Wide awakes. Counter jumpers. Those would be teams of clerks, and we have a lot of counter jumpers. My favorite, the deadbeats. That's why they're in the book. Deadbeats was sort of somebody that could be lazy or have an unsavory reputation, but that's in a little town called Ashley. I don't know if they had like a gang war in Ashley. It's a little bitty place between Centralia and Mount Vernon, but that was their name. I like that suckers, a lot of sucker clubs. Dirigo, D-I-R-I-G-O. What the heck is that? Anybody know what Dirigo is? It's the motto of the state of Maine. It's on their state crest. It drove me nuts till I finally just Googled it. What the heck is Dirigo? Oh, that's the motto of Maine. Oh, what does that tell us? That tells us in these towns there were people that migrated from Maine, and they adopted the state motto. A little town over in Clark County called the One Gallows. I guess all Marshall could afford was one gallows. They didn't they use it once every 10 years. I don't know. They never explain this stuff. It's just there, and they leave you a mystery. A team from Mount Zion called the Some Pumpkins, which is sort of a slang term. If you want to say, well, that was really something, you say, well, that was really some pumpkins. You had to be there. Rock Island, the Lively Turtles. Who wants to wear the Lively Turtles jersey and scamper around the base paths? The Molly Starks from Stark County, named after a Revolutionary War figure. And again, as I said, the Hunky Dories. What about this game they're playing? Well, no gloves. So everything, and you've handled those balls. You've seen the modern baseball. Modern baseball is a little bit harder, a little bit smaller. Those things will sort of soften up after a while, but they can still bust a finger. They can break skin. Sometimes some players have been known to catch a ball on the tip of their fingers and have to go lay down in the shade and have people fan them to bring them back to consciousness. I will not mention, modesty permits me from mentioning who that was. No strikes and balls called. Now, there's sort of a way you can call strikes, but this game is basically a game in which the pitcher is just a minor functionary. The pitcher's job is to get the ball up there where the hitter can hit it. It's a hitting game, a hitting and fielding game. Nobody wants to watch a pitcher. They want to watch people run the bases. They want to watch people chasing the balls. They want to see good fielding and good hitting. The bats were often homemade. They would have been a lot bigger. They might have stood up to here. We have one picture of a guy whose bat is about up to here. They wouldn't have looked anything like a modern bat, probably thicker and heavier. The balls were just starting now. There's a commercial market developing, and some of these little towns will advertise we have baseballs for the season. You could buy the balls, but some of them were probably still handmade. Until 1865, you could catch a fair ball on the mound for an out. So that's one way you save your hands. But in 1864, they passed the fly rule as a one-year experiment to go into effect in 1865, and it said from now on, if it's a fair ball, you have to catch it on the fly. You can't, wait for it to bounce. And they liked the experiment so much they never repealed it. But for a few years after that, you could still catch a foul ball on the mound. And there's a lot more of those than you would think, especially in compared to today's modern game. But eventually they got rid of that. You had one umpire. The umpire did not stand behind home plate. The umpire sort of stood over to the side. The umpire's job was a little bit different than it is today. People were not supposed to argue with him. In fact, no player could talk to the umpire except the team captain, and that's in here, too. You don't want that. That's a sign of poor sportsmanship. There were a lot of injuries, mostly what we would think of: broken collarbones from line drives, busted fingers. We have a couple of fatalities. Those tend to be younger kids who are either hit by a ball or a bat, usually some sort of lower body injury, which probably I've checked with some of my doctor friends and said, well, what do you think killed this guy? Probably had a ruptured intestine, and there was no way to diagnose it then. So, but not, that was a rarity. Maybe only 2 or 3 cases in the period I looked at. Most of the time, it's the rum and dumb, run-of-the-mill things. But these rituals and customs, this is a big part. Now, that's not in the rule book. You can look all day. Oh, what does Chadwick say about how we're supposed to treat teams? But it's expected. And I'll give you the best example I have involves a game between Jacksonville and one of the Springfield clubs. And Jacksonville is actually Jacksonville Unions, I think, or the Jacksonville Hardens. We're going to Bloomington. And that rail line's still there, goes up. And part of it is anyway. They were going to Bloomington, but they stopped off in Springfield to play like a 3-inning exhibition. So they get off the train in Springfield. They're met by the Springfield team. They're taken out to breakfast. Then they're taken to the state capitol building where a bunch of big shots, office holders and what have you, give them speeches and say how great they are. Then they trot over to out to the ball field, which is on the west edge of Springfield. It was actually called West Springfield at one time. And they play a 3-inning game, which Jacksonville wins easily. And they escort them back and put them on the train and they go off to Bloomington. Now think about the organization and time and trouble involved in this. Now there are other rituals at the end of the game. They were supposed to cheer the other team. The losing team had to give them a ball. Spectators were expected to applaud good plays, whoever made them. Not try and interfere with the umpire. And sometimes these games, after the games, there would be banquets, even stories about teams, opposing teams, marching arm in arm, linking arms and marching to a hotel where they were wined and dined, had bands playing, and went on into the late hours. Because the idea was the game itself. Whoever won, that's fine. Whoever lost, that's okay. We're going to celebrate the glory of this game. And I said, well, what? How do you know all this? Because when they don't do that, and as we get along in this period, there's examples of that. Newspapers take note, and it's sort of like a black eye on that town. Well, they're not gentlemen. They did not conduct themselves like, it's bad enough they beat us, and they didn't conduct themselves like gentlemen. And so you can't, this is something that Morris found, and I certainly found it as well, as pervasive in Illinois, especially in those 1865, 66, 67, 68. That was a big part of the game. And if you did not observe that part of the game, you were noted for it and held in less respect. Games were awful. They were awful, some of them, like this lawyer game here in Champaign County. Often double-digit scores. I mean, this 68-61 is not anything surprising. Sometimes it'll be like 102 to 51. Why do you suppose that? Why were all of these runs being scored? Were they that good at hitters? Or was there something else going on?
We were that bad fielders.
Exactly. They had not grown up catching balls. And especially with the fly rule, now I know Jed here knows what it's like to stick your hand up and say, I'm going to catch this line drive that's going 50 or 60 miles an hour. That's sort of the commitment. And sometimes try as you might, you can't do it. Those balls have a nasty habit of spinning and they don't stay where you think they're going to be. So that's what does it. It's bad fielding. And you got, hitting it, good hitting is easy in a sense, because you either hit the ball or you don't. The key is, can they catch it? So it's a different game. So that's one reason these things might go 3 or 4 hours, because it just takes them so long to get the 3 outs. And the coverage of the games often focus not, today if you read a story about a baseball game, well, you got a lead, right? What was the key moment in the baseball game? So-and-so had a walk-off home run. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Or Joe Blow, the pitcher, was sharp through 9 innings. Or the relief pitcher came in and, shut him down. It focuses on the game itself. These game stories, such as they were just the opposite. They focused a lot on pageantry, what's going on the field. And talk in the book, there's a chapter that addresses this. You can completely confuse yourself by reading these game stories, trying to figure out what was going on. Because they're not sports writers. These are guys who cover local politics or local news. They're as new to the game as anybody else. And so you have stories where people suddenly appear on base. You don't know how they got there. They suddenly disappear from base. You don't know what happened. And you try and go down there, these paragraph by paragraph, and, there's the narrative does not match up with the score. So a classic example occurs in Bloomington, right here. Well, okay. You can still go here. Anybody familiar with Bloomington? This is now Bent School, right? Bent School. It's not the same building. It was called the Fifth Ward School. This is about 4 or 5 blocks northwest of the square, maybe a little bit more. And this is a classic example of what a baseball field would look like. You see any diamond on there? You see any bases? Just an open field. That's all filled in with houses now. But in 1866, the Peoria Olympics came over there to play the Bloomington Baseball Club, which, by the way, was probably one of the top 3 clubs in the state at the time. They were really good. Again, we have examples in this game story of these mystery runners, mystery runs. But the big item was that in the 3rd inning, the game was stopped when, quote, a fat Englishman in the crowd persisted in getting in the way, and at this state of the game created a disturbance. So we have a drunk Englishman. We don't know what he was doing, why he was there, or what he was mad about. But you have this vision of some overweight son of Britannia wandering around here between first base and third base, and they have to shove him off the field, and somebody finally takes him under control, and in the next inning, which would have been, I think, the 4th inning, they get him set down on a bench somewhere or under a shade tree or whatever and quiet him down. But then in the 5th inning, and I'll read what happens, a female goose came on the ground and waddled towards the shortstop as if to take his place. But a ball from Stearns, a player for Peoria, drove her from the field. So they had Stearns, who was a military officer, founder of the Peoria Olympics, had a well-placed line drive which sent this goose into other fields of endeavor. So this is the type of stuff you get. Or, how many quote-unquote ladies were in attendance, and what the ladies were wearing, where the ladies sat, and how the guys looked in their uniforms, how sharp the uniforms were. And then a lot on these rituals, what was done for the team before and after the thing. So what does this end? What happens? What is this sort of to borrow a phrase from a great baseball historian, John Thorne, which is the title of a very good book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden. Why did this Garden of Eden go away? Well, in Illinois, we can point to 3 main things. Number 1, inner-city competition. So we have, accounts in the, I think we may even have some up here, of papers about this, where they would be upset. Yeah. See, a lot of these towns, they're competing not only for commercial supremacy within their neighbors, they're competing for railroad lines. This is the period when the railroad is exploding throughout the state. By the end of the 19th century, and this surprised me when I first encountered it decades ago, there was more railroad track in Illinois than any state in the Union. I mean, you would have had to look hard to find some place that didn't have a railroad going through it. And they're competing for that. And this is on the tip of that moment. So they're competing for that. And so the baseball clubs become a symbol of the town. And if you want to show, you're an up-to-date, hustling, vibrant town, well, you better have a baseball club that's, hustling and not like 0-15. They don't like, that's not going to set well. So, and you also have these natural rivalries. Now, I know, of course, I'm talking in Champaign, Urbana, so you wouldn't know anything about natural rivalries over here. But in Bloomington Normal, Or having grown up in Mattoon and Charleston, I can tell you, till the cows come home about, these little small town rivalries. So that's a big part of it. So here we go, the Bureau County Patriot. It won't do to have Princeton behind any other town in any respect. That could be everything from, the quality of merchandise to the honesty of the citizens to their baseball team. Princeton was they were really hot about having a good baseball team. The Champaign Empire Club is better than any in the congressional district. They like to brag. Newspapermen really like to brag in those times. And then this is my favorite, the Sterling Gazette. Somebody with some other town, I forget which right now, was talking about how they had a really good baseball team. So the Sterling says, well, you fellows are getting mighty anxious to get cleaned out. Come and see us when you boil over, and we'll try and exercise you a little on a 10-acre lot. Like, come on down here. And you have other examples of this when in other little towns, especially when one of these little towns beats a big town. I mean, that's going to carry them the rest of the year. They just talk about it all the time. The other one one that surprised me was gambling. Boy, it was pervasive. I think almost any time they had a baseball game, there was somebody on the sidelines taking bets. They'd be taking bets during the game, and that was part of the problem because the gambling passions would rise and fall depending on which team was doing better, and it eventually spills over in a couple of games and sort of doesn't quite interfere with the contest, but it comes close to it, and that sort of starts to disillusion people. And then these combine this rising passion to win, when winning becomes the main thing. Not this brotherhood, not this shared experience of joy and fun, but that score. When that score becomes important, well, why should we spend all this time and money on these rituals? We don't like these guys, we want to beat them. And so that undermines the rituals, and with the undermining of the rituals, that moment passes. The game doesn't go away. The moment passes. And again, we have an example of how this can affect how this worked out in Champaign. Now, the Champaign Empire Club was a pretty good club. It's hard to compare them because there were really only three clubs: the Chicago Excelsiors, the Forest City Club of Rockford. That's the most famous. That was Albert Spalding's club. He's in the Hall of Fame. I used to tell my students at Millikan, Albert Goodwell Spalding Jr. is one of those people that the more you learn about him, the more you hate him. Not on my all-time hit list. But and then the Bloomington Club, the Bloomington Baseball Club, because they did travel for a while. So they were playing Chicago competition. They were playing Rockford. They were playing St. Louis competition. Places, a lot of places like Champaign and Cairo and to a lesser extent Centriga, they were within their region. So they may have been very good. And in fact, I think Pana was probably very good. But we really can't say it with any definitive thing because we don't have no comparison, but I'm in comparison. But in Champaign, well, they were good enough to win they hosted a tournament in 1867. Where? Oh, I'd like to know. It's very hard to find these sites. Sometimes I used to think maybe it was what's now West Side Park. It would take some more research to try and figure out. Because they'll say, in these stories, they'll say, they will play a game at their usual grounds. Well, everybody in 1867 knew where their usual grounds was. This is the great thing about the past. They have no appreciation, no concern for the future. They'll figure it out in 2023. They'll figure it out on their own. But there was some reference to something happening at what I think is now West Side Park. But you guys can dig that up. We do know about a few places we can point to where they actually played. So they had this tournament. They had a team from Paxton. There were two teams in Paxton, the red shirts and the blue shirts. I don't know. Maybe there was, but they had two teams. There was a team from Urbana. There was a team from Ocala. Anybody know what Ocala is today? Arcola. The Arcola Pioneers. And then this team, the Vermilion Baseball Club. In what was to be the championship game, it was Danville, Vermilion Club, against the Empires, and the Empires were ahead 84-54 when they had to call it because of darkness. So the Empires were a better club. Danville had been a pretty good club up, At least they've been beating people of their own in their own area. And Danville was very good about it. They said, oh, well, you know, we would probably be entitled to second place, but we think that Urbana played a better game against Champaign, even though they lost, and so we cede second place to Urbana. Wow, I mean, have you ever seen that? I mean, does the team that finished second, you know, or second in the World Series say, well, you know, really, back in the league championship series, we ought to let those guys. They can have the loser's share of the world. No, that's not going to happen. So it seems like the relationship was pretty good between the two teams. So in October, Danville invites Champaign, the Empires, to come over to Danville, and they get on the train. Most of these teams travel by train, by the way. This is the other great thing. This is actually, if you look at it closely, this is a railroad map. And if you look at this, you'll see that almost every one of these things, if it's not on a railroad, it's on a river. They're not getting on the wagon. I found one example of Jacksonville going to Winchester or something. It took them like half a day to get back on the wagon. So they weren't doing that very often. They were taking the trains. So Champaign gets on the train. They go over there. They're supposed to play, and it rains. But this is where things get dicey. The Danville team says, well, the Champaign guys say they would magnanimously spend the night, and we would play the next day. So, and the sun, and the rain stopped, the sun comes out, it's a beautiful day in Danville, and this is what happened. Quote, when the morning broke clear and fair, and the Vermilion Baseball Club sought their friends of the Empires, behold, they had folded their tents in the light like the Arabs and as silently stolen away. Well, Champaign newspaper then responded and said the two most inflammatory words you could say at this time. They referred to the Danville Club as, quote, a country club. In other words, a bunch of yokels who we don't even, we were doing them a favor by even going over there. And so we get an editorial war. Most of the trouble is really started by newspapers. And the editors fight among themselves over what happened or what didn't happen and who's at fault and blah, blah, blah. And a couple of instances, we know the players didn't feel that way. Maybe they'll eventually write a letter to the editor saying, well, this is all off base. We don't have any trouble with those guys. But it soured the relationship. And even though Danville later defeated the Homer Eureka Club 92-37, boy, those Homer guys had a tough day, didn't they? They disappear. That's the last game they play. They don't organize for 1868. And this happens over and over and over again. Teams either they have a less than successful season, or they have a bad experience, they give up the game. Now the game doesn't go away, they're probably playing it informally on empty lots, but they don't go to the trouble of having these organized clubs, having to raise budgets, which costs money, and travel around. Those train rides aren't free, the equipment's not free. You can go, if you like playing baseball, why go through all that if you just want to go out and play with your friends? It doesn't cost anything, or not much. There we go. What I think the breaking point comes in October 13th, 1869, in Quincy, Illinois. You all know who these guys are. So why do we give a hoot about the Cincinnati Red Stockings? What's their claim to fame? Pete Rose is not in that picture. he's actually in the clubhouse making a bet.
Cincinnati was one of the original big league teams.
It was part of the original teams.
That's not the answer, though.
You're on the right track, though. What are all big league teams? What are they essentially? They're paid professionals. This is the first openly professional team. There's a lot of paid baseball players, including in Illinois, actually. But these are the guys that you go around the country. Only one of them is from Cincinnati. They get the best baseball players wherever they can find them. They pay them, and they are undefeated. They actually go all the way out to San Francisco. And on the way back, they agree to stop and play the Quincy Occidentals, the Occidental Seniors, which was the main adult club there. And Quincy has to pay them, since I was a history major, not a math major, let's see, $250. Well, that doesn't sound like much, except in 1869 it was $5,000. They had to pay pay Cincinnati $5,000 to play. They also had to pay, earlier Rockford had come down, the Forest Cities, they had to pay them. Because the Forest Cities are all but professional. You know, they've got side jobs and things like that. But Cincinnati is the first openly. Well, you know, Cincinnati beat everybody in 1869. Not only beat them, just, you know, obliterated them. So somebody, I guess, maybe thought this would be a good way to attract attention to baseball or something. So they move it to the fairgrounds. Why? Because they can charge admission. They're going to play on the infield, that racetrack infield, so they can charge admission and they can make, you know, meet this $5,000 guarantee. So, well, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to be a rout. In fact, we have one account says the only wonder is that no one was badly hurt, as the batting of the Red Stockings was at times terrific, and foul balls occasionally went crashing into the crowd, causing a momentary stampede. In fact, 2 people were hit by the balls. One, a little boy who was laying on the foul, you know, off the sidelines watching the game, he was hit in the stomach. And then a woman of mature years who was watching the game in her carriage, got whacked up somewhere on the side of the head with a ball, and she was game because she recovered her senses and stayed and watched it played out. When it was all over, the Red Stockings had scored 51 runs, and Quincy had scored 7. I think the Red Stockings defense must have laid down a couple innings to get those 7 runs in. And these were the best baseball players in the world at that time. What happens? That's the last game the Occidental Seniors ever play. They don't come back. And by 1869, there's only a couple of the adult clubs still functioning. A new team in Chicago Excelsiors that folded in 1868. There's going to be a new team in Chicago called the White Stockings in 1870, who are the forerunners of
The Cubs.
Right, we got a Cub fan here. All right, that's all right. Yeah, and that's another story how that happened. But anyway, and Rockford. The rest of them are either junior clubs or they've given it up. So Quincy was it. So this is discouraging. So and even before this, there's commentary. As early as I think it was 1868, James Schoaf, editor of the Decatur Magnet, says baseball is being killed by the growing custom of employing professionals to do the hard work and play the matches. Then Bloomington, and there's a whole story about this. This actually occurs in 1868, but they write this later. 1868, the Bloomington Baseball Club stops traveling, and they decide we're going to play all of these East Coast teams. At this point, the East Coast teams are coming through the Midwest between Chicago and St. Louis, and so there's Bloomington's right on that rail line, you know, so they stop. Their field was over, if you're familiar with Bloomington, on the west side where the driver's license station is now, that was the fairgrounds somewhere in there. They had the Brooklyn Atlantics, the Philadelphia Athletics, the Morrisania Unions, which was the Bronx, a couple others. They're just clobbered. I mean, this is one of the top 3 teams in the state, and it was, you know, wasn't even close. And so, after that, the Bloomington Baseball Club disappears, and in 1870, the White Stockings come through, and they throw together some sort of a team, and they play the White Stockings, and of course, the same result happens. And the Bloomington newspaper says, there's nothing to censure in baseball playing as it is. You can't, I'm sorry, the lower part's cut off. There's nothing to censure in ball playing as an exercise or recreation on occasion for students or persons of sedentary habits, for the glow of pleasures which it inspires, when once in a while a spirit of emulation is excited. But professional baseball, bah, what is it? So by 1870, all of those adult clubs are gone, again, save for Rockford and the new White Stockings, and the surviving clubs were juniors, and baseball's Garden of Eden, if you will, in Illinois is gone with them. So thank you for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions about anything you have. Yes?
I have heard that during the Civil War, the Union Army soldiers on Valentine's would play baseball. Was the fact that the Union soldiers came home, was that part of the uptick in interest in baseball?
Well, you know,
in this area?
that was one of the things I sort of started with, thinking, well, I'm going to find a lot of Union soldiers on these teams. And there were some. You know, some of those guys in Bloomington, and I know some of the, at least one or two of them in Cairo were, but the majority of them were not.
Oh.
So now this fellow who was very instrumental, Captain Stearns in Peoria, was actually an Army recruiting officer. He was a Civil War veteran, but his players, you know, were not. So, but we can say for certainly that the Civil War is what is the final death blow for the New England game and town ball, because that's what they ended up playing in camp, the New York game. And I can go into some of the details. There are different games and there's different rules, and the New York game is probably easier to play than the town ball and the New England game. So that it was a big thing. And I also think the other reason was these people went through 4 years of war. Most of them either had a family member or knew somebody, a relative or a friend who had suffered in the war. You know, they're desperate for something to take their attention away from that, something that's fun. And we go through that. We've seen that in our own time. Some of you folks are probably old enough to remember something called the hula hoop. Right? Everybody had to have a hula hoop. Why? You know, I don't know, but it was a lot of fun. You know, people on TV all the time. These things happen. So I sort of approach my book as much of a social history, maybe more of a social history than a sport history. Well, what is going on? You know, why is all of this enthusiasm being generated? And I think that's a big part of it. Here's a new thing. You know, something that nobody's going to get killed. You know, nothing's going to get blown up. There's no politics involved. We just enjoy it. So, but yeah, there were some, but it wasn't what I had originally thought it might be.
Bob, I imagine you get this question all the time, but not once tonight did you mention Abner Doubleday.
Yeah.
Can you separate fact from fiction here and tell us, did he play any role at all
No.
in the invention of baseball? Good.
There's a great book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden by John Thorne, who's the official historian of Major League Baseball. And the gist of the story, this is another count on the indictment of Albert Goodwell Spalding. So Spalding did not like the fact that our old friend Henry Chadwick kept saying baseball, American baseball, is descended from rounders. He really irritated him, even though they were friends. So they appoint this commission to investigate, you know, the origins of baseball. And as far as I know, the commission never met. They just took in these unsolicited testimonials. And sitting in Hartford, Connecticut, was Daniel Lucius Doc Adams, who they didn't talk to. Instead, they get a letter from some small town in Ohio from a traveling mining engineer who later goes to jail for killing his wife, but saying that, well, I was a youngster in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York, and Abner Doubleday came out and he got a stick and he drew this thing on the ground, and we all went out and played baseball. Well, this kid would have a heck of a memory, and he also had a creative memory because Abner Doubleday was nowhere near Cooperstown, New York. He was at West Point. He was in the Army. There's no evidence he ever played baseball, had anything to do with baseball. What, in 1908, when they make this decision, what is Abner Doubleday? He's very conveniently dead. He can't refute this. Why is Spalding so fixated, not only on, we can understand he's wanting to contradict Chadwick, but why pick on poor old, you know, Abner Doubleday? He hadn't done any harm. Well, Spalding's second wife was a member of something called the Theosophy. Has I got that pronounced? And it was sort of like a cult. I better be careful about that. It's still around, I think. I don't know like that. It was one of these sort of a hybrid religion that drew on all sorts of stuff. And they actually had a West Coast colony at, I think, what is now Pepperdine University. What's this got to do with Doubleday? Well, Spalding's wife was a big mucky muck. I mean, she was hardcore. And then, of course, Albert Goodwell Spalding was hardcore. He went along with her. And in his latter years, Doubleday had been the great poobah or whatever of Theosophy. He was like the presiding officer. So here we go. Okay, we can refute Chadwick, and we can elevate Theosophy by saying the founder, the head guy was a member of was the creator of baseball. Of course, they're conveniently dead. And this is all much more eloquently unwound in this. It's really a convoluted story. And for instance, the postmarks don't match. This letter from this mining engineer is mailed from Ohio and postmarked as received in New York the same day. Now this is not, there's no airmail. This was, so the whole thing was a put-up job. And even at the time, nobody believed it. But Spalding was an important guy, and he could say, well, that's the way. And from then on, his Spalding guides declared that Doubleday. And we probably remember those old classics, illustrated comic books we had when we were. I think there was one about the great Abner Doubleday and how I still have that little picture of him with the stick in his. No. So, and the guy I mentioned in the middle, Cartwright, Alexander Cartwright. There was a big excitement, I think in the early 70s. Oh, we found the father of baseball because we've got his diaries. And in these diaries, he allegedly writes about how, in New York, I helped invent this game, and then I went to California, and when I was in California, I organized teams there, and I went to Hawaii, and I organized teams there, and blah, 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 through these diaries. Well, the trouble was, those were typescripts. They were typed versions of the diary. Somebody in the family was not very smart because they let the written ones remain. And they got into the hands of the library. And somebody compared the typewritten things to the written things, and all the baseball stuff is not in the handwritten stuff. It was his son and grandson decided they were going to do something for old Alexander, and they concocted this thing. And so I say the only thing accurate on his plaque in the Hall of Fame, other than his birth and death date, is his name. All the rest of it's a lie, and they won't take it down. Yeah.
When I hear you talk about the pushback against professionalism, now I'm hearing something of the sociological division in cricket between gentlemen and players. Could you talk more about the sociology of any divisions within the players in this period in America?
Yeah, the professionals sort of sneak in under the cover in New York, and it's usually one or two guys. As those New York teams become very competitive in the 1850s and 1860s, they want the best players. Well, how do you get the best players? Well, maybe you got to pay them, but you can't pay them because that's against the rules. So we pay them under the table, and everybody knows they're professional, but nobody can prove it. And that was really disdained in the Midwest by the period we're talking about. In fact, the Chicago team, the Chicago Excelsiors, which is another long story, I won't bore you with it, they were publicly embarrassed after a couple of losses. So they come downstate, and they try and recruit players, and they recruit Bloomington's best pitcher, an Irish immigrant with the name of Patrick Keenan. There's an explosion in newspapers, not only in Bloomington, but around the state. What a scurvy trick. They use the term scurvy. What a scurvy trick. Why would you take this man away from his, and they also paid Albert Goodwell Spalding, too, at the same time they recruited him. So they couldn't really openly talk about it. There were probably some other paid players on the Chicago team. There certainly weren't any on, didn't come across any evidence of the Champaign clubs having it. But I think, to answer your question, yeah, it was really frowned upon. I mean, and that's part of this resentment we talked about, that these editors are expressing, that, well, this is a gentleman's game. It's supposed to be for health and exercise and fellowship. And now you're making it this vulgar, you know, thing. And then who are these teams? How can you have a Chicago team if nobody on is from Chicago? Now, we don't think a thing about that, do we? We don't care who the Cubs have on. Oh, we're gonna have a residency test. Did you go to high school in Chicago, or did you go to high school in St. Louis? No, we don't care anymore. That's the conditioning of.
But did we care whether the players in our club were laborers or lawyers?
That's a great point, because that was something else that puzzled me. And I spent a lot of time combining census documents and city directories when I had names. And it's amazing the small number of names you can actually rescue, full names, that you can then trace. And it's in the book. There's a lot of people in there I didn't expect to be, including people that work with their hands. So a lot of them would have been clerks, some lawyers, or political people, because they're the ones that had the time off. But I found no evidence there was any discrimination against people who were regular working people. In fact, one of the best players in Bloomington was a guy who was just a regular, I think he drove a wagon or something, and I think because he was so good, maybe his boss said, okay, you can have this time off. So no, I didn't find any discrimination in that. Even on clubs, you know, like in places like Springfield, where you have a lot of political people, or the sons of political people playing. There was a mix, much more of a mix than I'd anticipated. Because all the things I had read are generally sort of, well, these are all clerks and lawyers. They were upper middle class guys, and the rest of the people were just sort of left out. And that, not entirely the case.
Well, this was before the major leagues decided that they were white only.
Yeah.
Was there any racial mixture here?
Yeah. There was, and we talked about that in the book too. There was racial and gender discrimination. More, you know, the racial was much more apparent because there was more of it. There was a black team in Chicago that at one point the Chicago Tribune writer says, well, these guys are as good as, you know, good if not better than some of the Chicago teams, and they would not invite them to the all Chicago tournament simply because of their race. I found only, I think, one, maybe two examples of interracial games. It was in 1867, the National Association of Baseball Players, which made the rules, adopted this rule that no club that has a single member of the colored race on its roster can play a white club and have that game count. So basically, there was a team from Philadelphia that was very good, and they were trying to gain admission to the National Association of Baseball Players, which was led by a guy named Arthur Poe Gorman, who later becomes senator from Maryland, was a big racist. And Gorman was trying to entice the southern states, and that was the price. You know, we're going to have discrimination. If this is going to be an open game to all races, we don't want any part of it. So this is part of that whole period, you know, after the Civil War, with that reconciliation. Well, we know how that worked out. You know, reconciliation. Let us do what we want, and we will tell you about it or something.
Well,
So yeah.
even the local area later on, as the Eastern Illinois League formed and the Corn Belter League formed, there were only 2 African American teams that were a part of the league throughout its history. For the Eastern Illinois League, the Champaign Colts, which was managed by Eddie Glover, was a local barber in the area, was the only African American team in that entire league's
Weren't the
history.
Eagles an African American team?
I think they were Corn Belter, the Corn Belter League. Mm-hmm.
There was in the 1860s, there was a black team in Bloomington and a black team in Springfield. Those were the only ones I could find that were actually named. There were references to blacks playing baseball, usually in very derogatory, condescending terms. So, you know, if you want to keep your faith in humanity, do not read mid-19th century newspapers.
Well, one thing that I had a question about, we've talked a lot about how the rules change throughout baseball's history, especially early on. And especially now we're starting to see a somewhat slow decline of baseball in the modern era with blackouts and lesser attendance at games. But there are attempts to change the rules to try to make it more engaging. And we've kind of seen the most success with that with the Savannah Bananas, which what they're colloquially calling the banana ball.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what your opinion on that was and how they're attempting to change the rules of baseball today.
Yeah, I mean, these rules, and that's a whole nother thing, but they're constantly evolving throughout the late 19th century, in part to deal with cheating, because they figure out ways to get around things, or to deal with, pitching and what's going to please a crowd. And then in the 20th century, of course, the lively ball, the Babe Ruth era and stuff like that. I don't know. I mean, they've got, I haven't seen the Savannah Bananas, but I've heard a lot of good things about them. I think there's still an appetite. People want fun. And I guess I shouldn't confess this, being somebody that wrote a book about baseball. I just find it almost impossible for me to be interested in it now. Maybe because I'm a White Sox fan. I don't know. So, it's just, I don't know. Maybe it's a generational thing. At one time I was very, and that's not a critique of anybody that is. I mean, I blame myself. But I think maybe there are other people that way, and because it's not so much fun. I mean, it's all about, all these numbers and, negotiations. And I'm a labor historian. All these labor negotiations and salaries, and so-and-so's mad at so-and-so, and, it's just, and then all the players are constantly moving around, which I understand, they have as much right as anybody to get the most money they can. So I don't know what the answer is. There's probably people in here that are closer to baseball. I know Carl still follows it, and Dan as well. I think probably Jed too, and others. They'd be the ones to answer the question. What do you guys think? Do you think there's some way it can bounce back, or is it not even in trouble?
I think as fans, we've had a lot of fun experiences in major league ballparks.
Yeah.
We've had equally, if not more fun, at some minor league ballparks. The crowds are smaller, the game is more intimate. The sense of being part of, not in the game, but connected to it, as opposed to sitting in the upper deck somewhere. So the minor league game is really a good experience in our experiences.
Yeah, I think that's good. When I was going in I was a Cardinals fan, and that's going to make Dan and Carl unhappy. When I was a Cardinals fan in the 1970s, my wife and I used to go down to the old Busch Stadium, and I think 2 tickets in the upper deck, but they were good seats, I thought, because it was cool up there for one thing, were $1.50 a piece, and parking was like $1, and you could get in and out of there, for less than $10. We went to, again, here's a talk about loving punishment. I was also a Mets fan. We went to a Mets game at the new Busch Stadium, I don't know, 10 years ago or more. I don't know, was it $200 the time we got out of there? So it wasn't the same, laid back thing. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of success with independent teams also starting to form around the Midwest. A lot of rural teams in the Midwest started to lose favor and shut down. My minor league ball club that I went and threw the first pitch at since I was 1 year old at the Burlington Bees down at the southeastern corner of Iowa. They unfortunately lost their affiliation, and an independent team thankfully picked up the ball, and they're now playing down at that stadium too. And I know my dad still goes over there fairly regularly to watch them play.
Yeah, I think the place in Bloomington now, the Corn Belters, they've got a thing where a season ticket is $55, and you can go to 55 games, or you can go to 2 games. So there it is. And I know Dan's son has played in that stadium for the collegiate league team over the years, and it's a nice place. It's small. Maybe some of you've been there. And I guess if I was going to watch a baseball game, I'd probably want to watch one there than drive to St. Louis or up to guaranteed
Major leagues are doing everything they can to kill the minor leagues.
Yeah, I don't understand that whole contraction thing where they threw all those teams out. That's why I'm not a baseball executive and just an old historian. Yeah.
I want to change it completely and ask you about the paint-up.
Well, in the book, I have a chapter called Representative Clubs, and I'm trying to look at, 3 or 4 clubs that have different stories. And Pana is just this amazing thing. They were really good, and they also had a real good spirit. And they played a big role of sort of saving that tournament in 1867 in Decatur that almost fell apart because of bad sportsmanship on the part of Bloomington, actually, which is another story. They only lost 1 game, and that was to the Centralia Egyptians, which were pretty good, and that was one of their first games. And they clobbered Mattoon, they clobbered Taylorville, they kicked Decatur all the way from Macon to Forsyth, Macon County geography, and then just that was it. They had probably one of the best players in downstate, a guy named J.C. McQuigg, an Northern Irish immigrant, former Civil War officer, who we have descriptions of him. I think it was in a game in Vandalia. He hit the ball so far. There's no fences in those days, so it just goes until keeps going. Hit the ball so far that he could stop and rest at third base and then go home. And they would have little things in this, little advanced things in the paper about, well, now this is indicator. The fielder's indicator better be careful because one of his red hots, that's what they call a really hard hit ball, it might take the head off or something like that. I mean, he was. I would love to seen the film of him, but there's no film in 1867. So that's one of the ones. That is just. You think, well, what happened? Probably money. They just said, well, we can play among ourselves. They also had a muffin team there called the Wallopuses, allegedly led by a Catholic priest who weighed 300 pounds. So I don't know if they ever played. There's a lot of these muffin teams that probably never played, but existed in a cop. They sort of make fun of people in town. And I would like to see the Wallopuses play too. And women, there were girls playing there on their own.
In Pana?
Pana and a couple other places. And the Pana paper said, well, we went out and watched these girls play the other day, and I think guys better watch out because they're coming on. But they were, that was always condescending too. Whenever girls, and I'm sure there were women and girls playing baseball, all the time. Maybe not organized, but they were, out in the lot somewhere, slapping the ball around. But they weren't treated, well at all. There's one case of a women's team allegedly beating the Centralia Egyptians. It's called the Sorrow Sisters. So I don't think, well, anyway, we'll never, I'm going to give it to the women just for the heck of it, because it's not contradicting. They beat them. They beat the Egyptians, the best team in Centralia. God love them.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we don't have any additional time for more questions. That being said, Bob might stick around for a little bit longer, just in the back of the room. The library needs the space to clean. Once again, thank you all for coming out tonight. It was wonderful to have Bob Sampson come out to talk about history. And we invite all of our local community members. We have these history talks every single month. The next talk is going to be talking about the history of the Urbana Seminary. That's going to be happening in late March. We'll have information available soon. May. Did I say March? Yes, May. Otherwise, for the local community members, we do have receptions that are going to be coming up in early May. We have an exhibit that's going to be opening on the Julia F. Burnham Hospital and School of Nursing. The reception for that is going to be on May 7th. And then we are also going to be having a new art exhibit that's going to be the artwork and photography of a local photographer named Steve Hale. That reception is going to be on May 9th. So we welcome you all. Those are free to the public. You'll see information on our social media pages and websites. So we welcome you to come to the museum and join us to learn a little bit more history. Thank you.